So, Florence, we wrote a paper together, and we
did.
call it Coping and Co-Creation, One Attempt and One Route to Wellbeing.
Yes.
So, Florence, why actually did we write this paper?
So we wanted to write a paper talking about extremism and extremist individuals. And then as we were writing that paper, we realized that we needed to write a theoretical paper first about the root of identity before we could start talking about extremist individuals.
Yes, and then I was invited for a call on well-being, and we thought, okay, why not write a paper on identity and well-being? And that led eventually to this paper.
Yes.
So the paper that we're going to discuss. So this is a theory paper, and that basically means that we integrate ideas from different fields in such a way that they combine with very little friction and that the ideas enhance each other.
Yes.
And we really used a lot of fields. Biology, management theory, psychology and active cognition, identity research.
Yeah.
Sociology, yes.
International relations.
International relations, yeah. Political theory, auditory cognition, physics, security studies, not to forget.
Yeah, that's the one I study, yeah.
Yep. So it basically is an integration of all kinds of different fields, and they fit really well together. So that is the nice thing.
Yes.
So let's simply go through the paper.
Yes.
And the paper starts with an introduction, but we can kind of skip that. So let's go to section 1, called core cognition. So that first section, that is, we call it core cognition because we think it is the cognition that pertains to all of life, that is shared by all of life. And the key point of life is that it remains alive because it does stuff. So it is being by doing. Mm-hmm. And an agent is the thing that is alive. Actually, it's a living agent. But what is an agent? An agent is something that does stuff. And a living agent does stuff in order to remain alive. Yeah, so it is itself responsible for its own continuation. Mm-hmm. So that is kind of the key point. And another key point is that well-being is directly related to that. Well-being is actually just the distance from death. Yeah, so the more viable you are, the further you are from death, the more well you are. So it is the task of any living individual to ensure its own well-being and hence to ensure its own distance from death.
So the better the agent is being by doing, the more well it is and the more well-being it can possess or create.
Exactly, yeah. And so it's actually fairly simple, that part. And then we defined two forms of cognition. One form of cognition for survival and one form for thriving. And why do we separate those two? Well, actually for a very simple reason. And that is the reason that when you are in a problematic situation, you want to solve your problems and you want to get out of the problematic situation. And then you need a form of cognition that is aimed at solving your problems, but it is also at the same time aimed at removing the need for the activation of this form of cognition. So what it actually means is that if you solve your problem, then you don't have a problem anymore. So you don't need your problem-solving cognition. And then the thing is what is the other form of cognition? That is the form of cognition that you want to execute whenever you don't have problems, and hopefully most of your life. And that is a form of cognition that we call co-creation. And co-creation is basically about avoiding problems as long as you can. So it's a completely different form because this is aimed to perpetuate itself, while the coping form of cognition is aimed at ending itself. Success means that you don't need to activate yourself. Well, and so what we propose, or what we kind of define, is that intelligence is for coping, for solving problems. And when you were intelligent, and you solve your problems, then you don't need your intelligence as such so much, and then the other form of cognition takes over, which is much more related to wisdom, and which we call co-creation.
Yes.
To some extent, this is summarized in figure 1 of the paper. That is about life demands.
Yeah.
And life demands are actually also fairly simple. An agent needs to ensure that it remains alive and viable, so that its own body and its own, physical
essence
is maintained. But as a living entity, it is dependent on its environment. And that also entails that it should ensure that the environment, the habitat, is not degraded. And in order to prevent it from being degraded, you have to contribute now and again, or quite often, to your habitat.
Yeah.
And that is the key of co-creation. Yeah, so with co-creation, that is why we call it co-creation, you ensure that your habitat is, that you don't only take from your habitat, but actually, on the average, contribute to the habitat. And that leads to the gradual growth of the habitat and the subtotal, the sum total of all the contributions that life gives to habitats all over the world is the growth of the biosphere. Yeah. So this is a really important driver of life. And the short-term thing aimed at problems is on the left, aimed at maintaining and protecting agent viability, while on the right, it's more co-creation, and which is aimed at maximizing environmental and habitat quality, so that you can live in a world that is actually very easy to live in.
Yeah, a world full of opportunities.
Indeed, yeah, compared to a world filled with problems.
Yes. In the next section of this paper, we then link the concept of well-being and adequacy. So obviously all life strives to be well, but some life is better at striving for wellness than others. And this is essentially what adequacy is. So adequacy can be defined as the ability to avoid problems arising altogether. So that coping is rare and effective, and that co-creation is the sort of primary mode that agent is living in. The habitat viability is protected at a very high level. The carrying capacity of the biosphere, so the agent's inputs into the environment are very successful, so the carrying capacity of the biosphere increases. And in the long term, the agent's needs are satisfied, hence very few problems. So an adequate agent is generally pretty successful at creating the conditions for the preservation of its own well-being, whereas an inadequate agent, an agent which is not so good at this, is defined as kind of linking to what Chia just said, but it's defined as a tendency to self-create, prolong, or worsen problems that keeps an agent in this coping mode, in this coping trap. So inadequate agents often, as they're problem solving, because they're always constantly focusing on trying to solve the next short-term problem which keeps coming their way, their long-term goals and viability is completely neglected. So hence the problems keep on coming as the long term is so neglected and not looked after.
That then brings us to a new topic, that is what we call behavioral repertoire and worldview, and that has to do with the repertoire you have for coping and co-creation, and whether it is actually sufficient for the situation that you find yourself in.
Yeah.
And that has a lot to do with worldview. And what is a worldview? That is basically the set that all that the agent takes as reliable, so as true, in the sense of that it reflects the state of reality. And because you assume that it is true, you base your behavior on it. Yeah. So if you don't think it is true, you can't base your behavior on it. So the worldview is kind of the set from which all your behaviors are spawned. So we have two concepts, behavior, repertoire, and worldview. And worldview is a set of all that the agent takes as reliable and hence can base its behavior on, while the behavior repertoire is a set of all behaviors that the agent has access to. And that can be sufficient or more than sufficient, and then you're an adequate agent, or it can be insufficient, and then you're an inadequate agent. And we have different ways of being adequate and inadequate, but we come to that. So this is kind of explained in figure 2 of the paper.
Yes.
That is also called the behavioral repertoire. And in that...
The wheel of life.
Wheel of life, yeah. In that figure, that the core, the wheel, is strongly associated with a concept called core affect. And core affect has to do with our deepest moods. And it has to do on the, if you go to the central axis of the wheel, from being activated, deactivated, or being activated. And you can, and when you're activated, the world is typically eventful. And on the horizontal axis, that can be kind of a pleasure axis, but in this case we made it a high viability versus low viability axis. So what we typically want is we want to avoid the low viability side, and we want to go to the high viability side, and we want to remain there. So that is to also we want to avoid coping or do it very effectively so that we can then return to the right side, what's the co-creation side.
Yes.
And on the diagonal axis, we have two axes that are associated with the constraints and the possibilities that you have.
Yeah.
So in a nice, easy to live in world, there are few constraints that you have to satisfy. So basically means that you can do whatever you want and all is fine. The opposite of that is that you have to satisfy many constraints, and many constraints means that you have to be very careful not to make the wrong choices, because and then you can die, for example. So that is one axis, which has to do with how difficult is it to choose your behavior.
Yeah.
Then the other diagonal is whether you have few options, whether the world that you live in is deficient or you don't know how to use the world, so it feels deficient, versus you have many options. And this is then also associated with how you build up your behavioral repertoire. It can be inactive and narrow, which everyone starts like that as a baby. And then you can learn to make your repertoire more effective. And that is a fairly quick type of thing. You have to learn how to deal with problems. But it also means that you live in a world of problems because that's the only thing that you can deal with. And so the other way, that's the horizontal route, it goes from narrow to broad. And that is something that is more effortful because you have to sample the world really well. And you have to learn from all the diversity of the world. And the idea now is that you have to combine both. You have to go to the right in order to become very proficient in co-creation and be very comfortable in almost every aspect of the world. And at the same time, you have to learn how to become a really effective problem solver so that when you end up in problems that you can easily get out of the problems again. So that is pretty much everything of this picture. I forgot one thing, and that is the motivations that are also there. The words to avoid and to end, they are associated with the motivations to end being on the left side, while the motivations on the right side, wanting to perpetuate a nice situation or wanting to aim for an interesting situation, that is something that you voluntarily search for and want to maintain. So yes. I think we covered it all now. Then coping and co-creation is the second section. And we go in a little bit more detail about what coping and co-creation actually is. So the key point of coping is that it makes the world more predictable by reducing its complexity and creating systems of agents or objects or whatever with more predictable behavior. And in order to increase that predictable behavior by imposing control on agents and objects and etc., they bring threats to self under control. And that is an active process, and that requires energy, it requires resources, it requires continual maintenance. Mm-hmm. But in doing so, it promotes security. And what is security? It basically means that the threats are brought under control. So that is the key point here. Yeah. And the only way to do that is create something of an in-group of agents. And what is an in-group of agents? That is a number of agents who have the same limitations and hence have the same kind of possibilities and the same ideas of how to, what is a good idea. They share the same set of benefits.
Same worldview.
Same worldview, yes. And that means that they can work together. And they work together because they impose limits on themselves and limits on others, so that everything within the in-group remains within the limits of what they can deal with. That also means that out-groups are defined as those who do not share these limits, either because they have different limits or because they do not have those limits. Mm-hmm. But irrespective of whether outgroups are having different limits or no limits at all, they frustrate coordinated coping in the eyes of the in-group. Yes. So the in-groups really want something like a standardized individual that is easy to work with, while that is not necessarily the case for everyone. Yes. So that is kind of the key of coping. Co-creation is a quite different thing. But co-creation does not reduce complexity as such, but it tries to make the world more predictable by promoting the unconstrained natural behavior of all the agents. And so if all the agents do whatever they would normally do, that also creates a manner of stability and predictability. And you do that to ensure that every agent has access to easy need satisfaction, and that entails that you facilitate a high quality habitat where every agent can find whatever they need to be kind of happy. And this creates a safe environment where safety is defined as a situation or state with truly positive indicators of the absence of viability threat. So the difference with coping is that it tries to control all kinds of threats. But here it is about the absence of threats. And because you can't notice an absence, everyone needs to communicate, I see no viability threats, so I am going to do stuff that I really like. And that makes, for example, a sound, and via the sounds, everyone can communicate, I'm safe, I'm safe, I'm safe, I'm safe. So everyone communicates, everyone is safe, and that allows then the maintenance of an environment that feels truly safe and in which everyone can safely co-create.
Yes.
And so this also then brings us to what we call generalized wisdom, which is basically implementing this. This is the balancing skill to contribute to the biosphere. Yeah. And so that everyone does his or her little bit to improve the world a little bit, to make it more safe.
Yes.
Which is very, very difficult. But still, we know that life as a whole is able to do this.
Yeah.
So that brings us to section 3, which is about identity, but identity in a special way, namely as learning to co-create and to cope.
Yes.
The well-known identity researcher Brzezinski defines identity as a self-generated theory of me, or self-theory. But actually, it is a theory of me as an actor in the world. So that is reflecting back to being by doing.
Yes.
And we made a table where we combined the basic structure of identity to our ideas about coping and co-creation.
Yeah.
So that is table 3. Within identity research, we have two main axes. One axis is whether you are, when you can commit to certain life strategies, and the other axis is whether you had effective self-exploration and deliberate self-exploration. Yeah, so why these two axes? Well, the stable commitments mean that your strategies work and that you don't have to change them. So it is basically a measure of whether your strategies are adequate for the world that you're living in.
That's the horizontal axis.
That's the vertical axis.
But the line goes horizontally.
The line goes horizontally, yes. Yeah. So you go from below to above.
Yes. Yeah.
And so we have stable commitments. We have no stable commitments when basically you have no good skills, and you have stable commitments when you have effective skills to deal with the world.
Yes.
And the other axis is about self-exploration, and that is whether you become an individual who is unique versus an individual who is not really unique.
Not unique.
No. And so that leads to four combinations. Yeah, so the combination that is called an achieved identity means that you have self-explorated yourself. You went through a crisis in which you liberated yourself from all kinds of baggage that was not very useful from your youth, and you replaced that with more effective stuff that is of your choosing, and that ensure that you know yourself well and that you have very effective life strategies.
Yes.
And we actually interpret this as that you have good coping and co-creation strategies.
Yes.
And because you have that, you can actually self-actualize because you are hardly in problems. And if you are in problems, you can solve your problems fairly quickly, and then you can return to the self-actualizing state. So that is the achieved identity.
Yeah.
And then we have identity moratorium.
Yes.
Yeah, which is that the self-exploration crisis is still in progress. So it hasn't led to really high quality skills that you can really rely on.
No.
And hence, you can't make your identity kind of stable. So these are typically people who search, who go from one mode of getting to know and understand themselves to another. And I think we know those kind of people.
One ideology to the other ideology.
Yes.
40-year-old, these people who are 40 years old and they are still seemingly on their gap year.
Yes, and try yoga for a while, and then
went on some silent retreats,
learn another skill, etc.
Yeah. Lots of exploration, but not a lot of results.
Nope, at least not yet.
Not yet.
But there's still development going on.
It's a work in progress.
Yes. Then we have the identity foreclosed, and the identity foreclosed means that the development of the identity has actually been stopped. And how has it been stopped? Because these people did not really self-explorate, but instead adopted the norms of society as their basis in life. And so they become very proficient in adhering to all the rules of society, adhering to the rules of their ideology, adhering to the rules of their religion. And they have a very effective but targeted behavioral repertoire.
Yeah.
So whenever they are in a situation that they can deal with it very effectively. But when they are brought out of that situation, they are confronted with their inadequacy to deal with that. The first thing that they are going to do is to change the world towards that they feel adequate again.
Yes.
And that has everything to do with the authoritarian state of mind.
Yes.
The foreclosures, they latch onto a narrative, an ideology or whatever. And whenever they feel that they are brought out of the comfort zone, the first thing that they're going to do is to get rid of the diversity that makes them feel inadequate.
Yeah.
And that makes them intolerant to diversity, and that is especially the case in a fearful situation. So where they are already fearful, they become hypersensitive to diversity that they can't deal with.
Yeah.
And this is what Karen Stenner, an authoritarianism researcher, calls the authoritarian dynamic,
which
is basically that intolerance to diversity scales with your level of authoritarianism, which is the normative identity style and identity foreclosed, times the normative fear level.
Yeah. Yeah. The unspoken motto of the normatives is, we are right and you must change.
Yes, to comply with
us, to adhere to our rules and our standards and our routines, because we are right.
Yes. And Florence, you can best do the identity diffusion, because that is your specialty.
The diffusions, they're just so confused, aren't they? They're so confused. So at the bottom in the bottom left-hand corner of our table, we have the identity confusions, and these are people who live in a world just surrounded by so many problems, and they don't seem to have any of the correct skills, either coping or co-creation, to deal with any of these problems. So they have a lot of undeveloped skills. Also, as a result of these lacking skills, often when aiming to improve their well-being, they often are confronted by not only their own inadequacy, but they accidentally create more problems for themselves. Though their intentions are often good, they just don't have the capacity to realize these intended outcomes. And as a result, they're very confused. They're often quite frustrated with the world and themselves. And it's also they don't have any stability either in their identity. It's very fluid. And also, I think, overall, very little self-development, a very narrow and minimally effective behavioral repertoire, and just inequipped to deal with the world and the problems that it is inevitably filled with.
Yeah. So here we connected on a theoretical level the ideas of coping and co-creation with the structure of identity, and it was kind of nice that it fitted so well.
Yes.
So this is one of the contributions of this paper.
Yes, it's almost like it's all part of a big picture.
Yes. So, talking about a big picture, let's make the picture bigger.
Yes.
Our fourth and last section was about 2 routes to general well-being.
Yes.
And so maybe I can start this part. It's more your part, but I can start with the first part.
Yeah.
That's the difference between safety and security. And I am a soundscape researcher, so I am interested in what makes, for example, a nice environment nice. And one of the things that we discovered a few years ago is that in a nice environment, there are indicators of safety. And we tested that, and we indeed found, for example, that very vulnerable people, like people with dementia, for example, they like indicators of safety in their environment, and that makes them relax. The moment you get rid of those, then they become agitated, they get problem behavior, etc. So we kind of understood that, and here we separated the terms security and safety, and we already defined that a bit, but it's good to do it again. So safety basically entails that everyone communicates, I feel safe, and that allows a situation of co-creation. Security means that the threats are brought under control, and that means that they are controlled, which entails the active suppression of all kinds of unwanted diversity and all kinds of and other threats. So that is an active process. It takes much more energy, and those seem to underlie two important concepts that we use in section 4, and that is ontological security and psychological safety. They are completely different beasts.
Yes.
And you came with ontological security.
Yes. So essentially, these two concepts outline the way that we conceptualize coping mode and co-creations mode to creating well-being. And the security side is actually wonderfully analyzed by various scholars of sociology and international relations, and it is this concept of ontological security, and it's all ontological security. The first time it was really developed and used was by a psychoanalyst called Lane. And essentially, his speciality was looking at people who were having psychoses or were really sort of very, very mentally unwell. And what he found is that people that were experiencing psychosis or, were really sort of mentally unwell had a very unstable sense of who they were, and they didn't have a stable idea of where their life was going and who they were on a continual axis. So he kind of developed this idea, and he said, this is what I'm going to call ontological security. It's the person's security and confidence that they are the same person today as they're going to be tomorrow. Then along came a sociologist, Giddens, and instead of only applying this theory to the mentally incredibly unwell, he decided to extend it across the whole of society. And basically, what he argued was that ontological security was very important for an individual's security and happiness and well-being. And what what ontological security is, by his understanding, is the secure feeling that an individual derives from having answers to problems and solutions to issues in their everyday life, so that all of these issues are sort of kept under control so they can carry on with their routines and get on with their everyday life. So essentially, what ontological security is, it is the secure feeling one derives that today will be more or less the same as tomorrow. Essentially, it is security derived from predictability. And what Giddens was kind of visualizing here was a symptomless society, a society that didn't have sort of obvious symptoms that people were very unwell, essentially, sort of didn't have a high level of well-being. So a measure of ontological security is how comfortable someone feels in their comfort zone. And a crucial part of creating this well-being within the comfort zone is this term habitualization. And essentially, habitualization is the consolidation of routines using socially constructed myths and shared knowledge and stories and all of these things that sustain an in-group identity, which then provide the individuals with a guide for their future action. So essentially, habitualization is basically the process of becoming ontologically secure. So it is taking in this shared knowledge and these habits and these routines, and hence you have a guide for how you should behave in the future. And obviously, as Chid mentioned earlier in the video, in-groups are defined by this feature. They are defined by a common habit, a common habitualization. So everyone in the in-group shares all of these routines and all of this knowledge, so they work very well together. However, everyone who is in the out-group, who does not share these routines, who does not share these habits, is seen as a threat to this oneness, this sameness, and this ontological security. And as we are in the coping mode, threats must be controlled and diminished and extinguished. Another thing that makes these outgroups so problematic is that when you are a foreclosed identity, you are only really familiar with your own in-group's rules and habits and shared identities. So you construct the outgroup's identity purely with reference to what you experience in your everyday life. So as a result, the outgroup is always going to be constructed as inherently different, always problematic, with a focus on sort of like the difference rather than the sameness. And hence, you know, a lot of these processes of creating ontological security via creating well-being via ontological security often involve othering, and often can be quite violent. They can be quite counterproductive as well. So via ontological security, what you sort of end up is with a group of individuals who are very normal, and they are all the same. And because they are so normal and the same, they are actually abnormal, because they shouldn't be so, that there's no uniqueness, that it is all a shared sense of oneness. And this is what Aldous Huxley calls abnormal normality, but in our paper we call it pathological normality.
Huxley describes that. He says something like, these millions of abnormally normal people living without fuss in a society to which, if they were fully human beings, they ought not to be adjusted. They still cherish the illusion of individuality, but in fact, they have been to a great extent be de-individualized. Their conformity is developing into something like uniformity, but uniformity and freedom are incompatible. Uniformity and mental health are also incompatible. Man is not made to be an automaton. If he becomes one, the basis for mental health is destroyed. Yeah.
And this is what Lane has identified.
Yes, as kind of the ideal of his work. So basically getting rid of all the symptoms of being unhappy, of all the symptoms of actually living a full life. There are no symptoms, but there is also no self-actualization, because everyone becomes uniform.
So now we're moving on to psychological safety. And in this section, we use the work of Clark, and what his work is all about creating successful and motivating teams. And in his book, he essentially defines psychological safety as the condition where you feel included, free to learn, free to contribute, and also free to challenge the status quo. So the normal, without fear of being rejected, punished, or excluded as a result. So from the beginning, what sets safety apart from security is this idea of unconditional acceptance. Whereas an in-group, you have to, it's very conditional. You have to take up these rules and routines. With safety, the only condition is that you are a human being and you can join us. So that then the second step towards psychological safety is learning how to learning from the group and the environment, and learning how to become an adequate agent. So essentially, this is all about learning from people around you, self-developing, and from this, once you have learned, then there is the step over into actually being an actor and really contributing to the environment. And this is when contribution comes in. From a very fundamental position, if you are contributing successfully and therefore enjoying the environment you are in, of course, you are not going to want to harm that environment. So that the environment, of course, becomes safer and safer. It's completely, common sense. And then the final step towards psychological safety is challenger safety. And this is the idea that you can challenge the status quo without being fearing rejection. And challenger safety signals that the individuals have overcome the pressure to conform, and hence they can enlist themselves in co-creative processes, improvement and self-development and innovation without fear of social rejection.
And this is, of course, in complete opposite to intolerance to diversity that characterizes coping and characterizes the normative identity style.
Exactly. It is a celebration of diversity.
Yes, instead of trying to suppress it as much as possible.
Yeah.
And which was the key point of ontological security, in trying to create all kinds of very standardized individuals without symptoms.
Yeah. Yeah.
So we summarized this in a little picture that is figure 3, which we call the well-being pyramid. Well, there's also something you created it.
I did, by doodling.
Yeah, by doodling. Yeah. Well, you can do that again.
Yes, I'm sure some of you recognize parts of the pyramid from Maslow. It's probably one of the most famous pieces of exported academia.
Yeah, so what we did is that we basically said that the bottom is for dealing with problems.
Yes, that's the coping.
So, that's the coping part. Then we have the middle part in which you learn how to co-create. And if you've done both, then you end up at the top of the pyramid with, maintaining well-being and especially self-actualization.
Yeah.
We say that the steps is first that your physical needs are met, and then that your security needs are met, but that actually this is security needs, it's not safety needs. So this is about that the in-group conditionally accepts individuals. And conditionally means that if you comply with the rules, then you are accepted, and otherwise you are excluded. But at a certain moment, then the conditions for discontinued coping, basically the absence of problems, is being met, and then you can progress to the second level, where the community unconditionally accepts you as an individual, and then you truly your belonging needs are truly being met. The next step, of course, then is that you are, as an individual, you can freely learn, freely contribute, and freely criticize your community. And with that, you can contribute to the community and improve it. And that leads then to eventually that all the conditions for successful co-creation are met. So this is our kind of model of society. And then with ontological security, kind of the only thing that you can really reach is the level of the first 1/3 of the pyramid. You need psychological security in order to reach the next level, and you need to master that really in order to reach the top.
Interesting is that ontological security is still a theory which is being used up until this day by lots of sociologists and IR scholars. In fact, when I was doing my master's, I had to use the theory throughout one of my courses, and I find it surprising because it is obviously very flawed, because it conceptualizes the world in a way where conflict or insecurity is inevitable, because one group's security can only go up at the expense of another's group, which I thought is an interesting theory to teach to crisis and security masters, but alas, we digress.
In this last part of the paper, we looked at two theories from a meta-theoretical perspective. So we looked down and we looked at what are the properties of the theories. So
Yeah.
one was very clearly started with all the what we call the ontology of coping, all the ideas that belong to coping, which includes, for example, the security thing, which is in the name, but also problem solving, standardization, and those kind of things. While the other was exactly the opposite. It was about safety. It was about developing your individuality to the max and allowing everyone to contribute freely and unconstrained. And so those are two different ontologies that we think are really interesting, and we have to discover them better. But they are in one of the tables of the paper that we have skipped for this moment.
Yeah.
We used the theory that we've developed to make a little bit more sense of identity. So that was a direct application of the concepts of coping and co-creation and adequacy, etc. Sure, we have a number of ideas of how to use this.
Yes.
So one is that we're going to apply it to extremism study, which was the original aim.
Yeah.
And but we think actually there are many more things. So, for example, the difference between the left and the right hemisphere, as conceptualized by McGilchrist in his book, The Master and His Emissary, fits also really well to what the master does, which is co-creation, and what the emissary does, which is problem solving. We have the dual processing ideas about two different processes in the brain that also fit really well. Another application might be happiness research and education research in how to actually educate people so that they become both proficient in problem solving, which is usually fairly well the case because that's what we do in education, but also become very good in co-creation.
Yeah.
So those are the type of things that we want to develop further with this work. And that is actually great fun.
Yes.
Yeah, so maybe a last question to you, Florence. What makes this fun?
Because it's incredibly satisfying seeing all of these theories come together in such a nice, well-fitting way. And I cannot think it is coincidence. I feel that all of these scholars are tiptoeing around essentially the same ideas, the same constructs, the same ontologies. And I feel that what we're trying to do is link them all together.
Yeah, it's actually pretty simple what we do. There are so many examples of high quality insights that almost shout to be integrated.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. They're screaming at you. They're screaming.
Yes. So
Right.
Let's stop screaming then.
Yes.
Thank you, Florence. And well, we might do this again at some point.
Yay.